Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the topic, but most importantly, I love to make something fun and interesting to learn. And actually, this is video 3 in an ongoing series that I'm making on EE's video titled, Are the Extreme Economic Systems Totally Pointless? And I definitely encourage you to watch the other 2 videos, not only to get you up to date, but also just to give me more views, which is always good for me. And in today's video, we're going to be going over the section where he talks about factory conditions, and he talks about how it was mostly the rich and the nobility who were in factories, and also how the workers were exploited, and ultimately how they weren't paid their fair share. And they worked in really crappy conditions, and it was generally bad for most people, except of course for the owners, which, according to Economics Explained, from here on in called EE, this was good for them and bad for everyone else. And so what does the evidence have to say on the matter? Well, let's get into the video and find out.
Kings and lords and nobilities owned the land, and the serfs worked the land with their labour. The advent of modern manufacturing suddenly meant that capital, which is things like machinery, also became a very important factor, and this was primarily owned still by the nobility.
Okay, so the question then is, was it primarily the rich? Was it primarily the nobility who owned the capital? Was it primarily this class of people who started and controlled the first factories, and indeed would continue to run the factory system up until well into the 20th century? So before we break down the claims into more detail, it's worth going into what image EE is trying to conjure up of the factory system. And this is very much the classic image we have of the factories. They're big, they're dirty, they're disgusting, they're certainly unsanitary. Lots of people are working in very tight, cramped conditions. These factories are certainly not romanticized in any way, shape, or form. And even though EE does not directly say it in his video, the classic version of the factory is that they opened up, and what they did was that they destroyed jobs in the countryside so that people from the countryside had to migrate into cities, and the only jobs that were available were these crappy factory jobs. It is said that these working conditions are bad, not only because of the new technology and the new way of working, but because these low-skilled workers had nowhere else to go. Only the factory system would accept these newly arrived immigrants, these migrants from the countryside. And in this version of history, which I'm about to tear down, it goes without saying that in the popular conception, these factories are largely homogeneous, as in they're mostly the same, and that they're all profitable, and that they're all indeed very, very large. So these are the claims. Let's break them down in detail. So who started and owned the first factories? It is indeed the case, as EE claims, that the nobility did own a lot of capital, and some of them did indeed help create the first factories. However, the majority of the entrepreneurs that helped create the first factories actually came from the middle class, or what we might approximate to be the middle class at the time. These are not simply people who had a bit of money and then they wanted to start the first factories. These people were predominantly very, very skilled, and they had to have many different skills in order to run the first factories. Because this was such a new way of working, there was no established template to draw upon. And so these people had to do many different jobs at once, including all of the bookkeeping, they had to handle a lot of the maintenance, they had to get finance, and so on. And to prove my point, we get the following quote from Nokia, who says, while a few of the great industrialists came from the working class and a few came from the nobility, the vast bulk of the successful entrepreneurs of the Industrial Revolution came from the commercial and industrial middle classes. And so yes, many of the first industrialists and simply the first factory owners were rich, but the majority of them got rich through their activities with owning and running the factories. It was certainly not a given that they would remain rich, and indeed many of them died poor. And it was not a given that they would come from rich backgrounds. Okay, so we've talked about the owners of factories. What about factories themselves? What can we say about them? As should be obvious by now, factories were not a monolith. They were not simply a one-size affair. There were many, many different factories, ranging from small to large, unsuccessful to successful. And it depended largely upon the people who ran these factories. And once again, it should be stressed that these people had to be very skilled at their jobs in order to run these factories and to continue their operation as the years went by and as competition increased. Because of course the factories were in competition with one another. But this lengthy quote from Merkai sums it up best when he says, it cannot be repeated often enough that the factory, in our minds associated with a large and usually ugly and user-hostile mill employing many workers under conditions of strict discipline and control, was still not the typical employer in the British economy by the mid-19th century. Small, flexible firms even when they were quite modern in their technology, remained far more common, in part because they had the agility to adapt, to transform their techniques and products as demand patterns or other economic parameters changed. These features often more than offset the economies of scale that drove the emergence of larger plants. In much of the British economy then, smallish workshops remained the rule. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the first wave of industrial workers, the first generations of people to work in factories, were actually very skilled people. And because of these high skills, people were actually paid a premium to work in the factories. Now, this premium does not necessarily improve people's lives, and it is often referred to as a compensating wage. That is an additional wage that has to be paid to compensate people for the very poor working conditions they faced. But these were not low paid jobs. But with that, let's go into more detail with the workers themselves. There's very good evidence that the work week and the workday itself was shorter in the 1700s than it was in the 1800s and the 1900s, especially when it came to factory work. Indeed, in factories, you often work 12-hour shifts with 1.5 to 2 hours each day to eat. There might be enough time to cover your lunch and your dinner. And so, of course, put that way, factory work sounds downright awful and does sound as bad as EE makes it out to be, and indeed the popular conception we have of factory work. However, there are a few facts worth mentioning. Agrarian workers, or simply people in the agricultural sector, of which the majority of people worked in this sector, even though there might be around 250 work days in a year, most people did not get that much work each year. And we have evidence that seasonal workers actually got paid a higher wage than people employed on a full-time basis to compensate them for the fact that they might have work for a few months, but they might be out of work for the next few months before finding work again, if they do at all. And so even at the time, the anxiety of being out of work and not knowing when you'd work again was very well recognized. And the negative effects were very well documented. And this is true today as it was back then. And so the idea is that people might prefer to work in a factory where you were employed on a full-time basis, and whilst you might get paid less on an annualized basis by working at a factory as compared to working on a farm, this was a constant. This was something safe. This was something you could rely on throughout the year, and it made it easier to make financial and economic decisions, which is something we all value today. And so certainly for some people, given the choice, they would choose to work in the agricultural sector where work was uncertain, as opposed to working the long, grueling hours in a factory where they get a lower wage. However, that was not the case for most people. You can ask this of yourself. Would you rather work in a permanent full-time job that pays a little bit less as compared to being a business owner where you might have really high highs, but you might also have really low lows? And those lows might last for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Can you survive that long with very little cash flow and very little certainty about the future? But factories were not a static affair, and changes did come to the factory system. And I quote, "In the second half of the century, the 19th century, the old work routines gradually disappeared, those old work routines being from the agricultural sector, but they did so within the context of a shortened workday, the introduction of bank holidays, half-day working on Saturdays, and some improvement in the working environment. These changes were caused principally by the increasing scope of the Factory and Workshop Acts, and also to some extent by trade union action."
Labour was made far more efficient by capital, but labourers were not the secret ingredient, so they didn't really benefit from it in the same way that capital owners did.
Okay, so I will say that on this part, I could not find direct evidence that answered these questions. However, I do have answers for some of the aspects of the questions raised. I can tell you with certainty that the secret ingredient was not cheap coal. Cheap coal in Britain only came about as a result of investment in capital. It was investment into improving the quality and the efficiency of the machinery used, because the first machines were comically inefficient, and the only economical task for the first engines was to pump out water from the mine. Now, certainly this is important at the time because it allowed people to dig further and further into the ground. However, if the machine was any further away from the coal mine, the transport costs rendered the machine useless. And so over this time, most of the improvements went into capital. And so yes, capital was expensive, but so was labor. And so the first industrialists mostly chose to invest into capital to make that cheaper, whereas labor remained expensive throughout this period. And over this period, since labor remained an expensive input into the factory system, What does this say about the first industrialists? Were workers not the secret ingredient, as EE claims in his quote? Whilst I could not find evidence to answer these questions directly, there are some facts about factory work conditions and pay that I do want to share. The large wage difference between English workers and their European counterparts really only came about in the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was well underway. This would indicate that it was industrialization that drove higher wages for people in Britain, as opposed to higher wages being a reason for Industrial Revolution to start in the first place, as opposed to higher wages already existing and this creating the need for the factory system to come about. So this fact that Industrial Revolution drove higher wages in England and of course improved the lives of at least some people at this time is important for a number of reasons. Firms were not just trying to replace people with machinery, as the high wage hypothesis of the Industrial Revolution would say, and indeed as EE is trying to claim, but in fact, machinery made people more productive, and those people could then get paid more. Far from replacing workers with the machinery, they made workers, and indeed more workers, more productive, which allowed more people to get more money. However, in saying all of this, it would be outrageous to conclude from all of this that the first factory owners, or indeed factory owners down the line, were somehow benevolent because they preferred capital-saving technologies rather than labor-saving technologies, and that they were somehow blessing the people at the time with these jobs. However, the fact that the more productive workers, especially the first waves of industrial workers in these factories, got paid higher wages does make this point somewhat moot. Basic economics came into play, and factory owners had to compete with one another. And if in the aggregate workers were more productive and they didn't get paid their fair share in one factory, well then they would simply pack their bags and move to a competing factory. And so this was one reason for when the factories started moving into cities, the people started to move into cities. There was more competition and it was easier to find a job, alongside of course making it easier for the factory owners to find workers. And so to conclude, of course, factory conditions at this time were terrible, but they were not uniformly so. A lot of people preferred this work to working in the countryside, especially because working in a factory was guaranteed employment, even if the wage was slightly lower than what you could get working in the agricultural industry. However, because your job was much more guaranteed, it made it easier to smooth out your income and your consumption, and that in turn made it easier to make economic decisions, especially in an increasingly complex world. People were not being replaced by machines at this time, and in fact they were made more productive by machines at this time, and they got paid a higher wage because of this. Not necessarily because the factory owners were somehow benevolent, but because basic economics and competition forced the factory owners to pay their more productive workers more money. The other thing is that the factory owners were predominantly from the middle class, and they had to be very skilled, and there were many different roles that each factory owner had to take, simply because this was a new way of working, a new way of thinking, a new way of doing things. And they had to invent all of this as they went along. And so you can see that there's very little merit to the simple story EE is trying to paint about factories, factory owners, and indeed the workers. Whilst of course there is some truth to what he's saying, there is much more complexity in the story. And indeed the reality is that there's much more agency on the part of the factory workers themselves. Many people did indeed choose to make a rational decision to work in the factory system, if for no other reason than the factory system was better than the alternative. And so that's all I wanted to say in this episode. I will of course be continuing this series, so if you do have any questions, feel free to ask in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer, or I'll collect a bunch of questions and answer them in a follow-up video. But that's all I wanted to say in this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate and share, and hit that bell notification because all of these things help my channel, and I'll see you guys next time.